There is one verse in Genesis that a lot of people point to when the subject of food comes up. Maybe you've heard it before. Genesis chapter 9, verse 3. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And for many people, that's the end of the discussion. Case closed. God told Noah he could eat anything. Pigs, shellfish, whatever moves. At least that's how it's usually understood. But I have to be honest. Something about that explanation always bothered me. Because if Noah suddenly received permission to eat every animal after the flood, then there is a question we have to answer. How did Noah already know the difference between clean and unclean animals before the flood? Think about that for a second. Moses wasn't even born yet. Mount Sinai hadn't happened. Leviticus didn't exist. And yet somehow Noah already knew there were distinctions. So where did those distinctions come from? And if they already existed, did Genesis 9 really erase them? Or are we missing something? Because once I started looking closer, I realized that Genesis 9 says something most people completely skip over. God doesn't simply say, I give you everything. He says, as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. And that little phrase changes everything. Because suddenly God is pointing Noah backward, not forward, back to creation itself. So let's go back. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 29, God says, Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. Now, something interesting shows up here. God doesn't just say every plant. He specifically mentions seed-bearing plants and fruit trees. Then in the very next verse, we read that every green plant was given to the animals. In other words, there was already a distinction. There was already order. Not everything green was designated as food for mankind. Some things were, some things weren't. And that's what makes Genesis 9 so interesting. Because when God tells Noah, as I gave you the green plants, he seems to be pointing back to an established pattern, not to the removal of distinctions, but to distinctions that had already existed from the beginning. And honestly, that raises an even bigger question. If clean and unclean animals were invented at Sinai, then why did Noah already know about them? Because before the flood ever came, God instructed Noah to bring both clean and unclean animals onto the ark. Not just animals, clean animals, and unclean animals. That distinction already existed, long before Moses, long before the law, long before Leviticus, and then after the flood, the very first thing Noah does is fascinating. He builds an altar, and he offers sacrifices. But he doesn't offer just any animal. He offers clean animals. Why? Because apparently Noah understood that not everything was acceptable. And maybe that's where the story gets deeper. Because the more you look through Scripture, the more you realize that food and worship seem to be connected. Think about it. The very first command given to Adam involved food. You may eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. And the first sin involved eating what God had forbidden. That's interesting, isn't it? Food was connected to obedience right from the beginning. Then Noah steps off the ark, and his first recorded act is worship. And later, in Numbers chapter 28, offerings are even described as God's food. Of course, God doesn't eat like we do. But throughout Scripture, fire from heaven consumes what belongs to him. And something else becomes obvious. God does not accept everything. He accepts what he declares acceptable. Not what man decides. Not what culture decides, what he decides. And maybe that's been the issue all along. Not personal preference, not convenience, but approaching God on his terms. Because this pattern keeps showing up. Isaiah rebukes those who eat pig's flesh. Malachi rebukes polluted offerings. Paul warns believers about eating without discernment. Acts 15 still tells believers to avoid blood, things strangled and things polluted by idols. And even in Revelation, warnings connected to what people eat haven't disappeared, which tells me something. The connection between food and worship never really goes away. And maybe that's because this story was never just about food. Maybe we've been asking the wrong question. Instead of asking, what can I get away with? maybe we should be asking what delights the heart of God. Because when you step back and look at the whole Bible, food seems to appear everywhere. Adam, Noah, the sacrifices, the feasts, the prophets, the apostles, and finally, the marriage supper of the Lamb. Isn't that amazing? The Bible ends with a meal, not because food is the point, but because fellowship is. Song of Songs says, "He brought me to the banqueting house, and his banner over me was love." What a beautiful picture. An invitation, not just to eat, but to commune. Not merely to receive provision, but to enjoy fellowship with the one who made us. And maybe that's what Genesis 9 has been pointing toward all along. Because perhaps this was never simply about food. Perhaps it has always been about fellowship. And fellowship has always been about approaching God on His terms, rather than our own.
Thank you so much for watching Remnant Revived. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and click the video for more. And we'll see you in the next one.